Hi, folks. It's one of your hosts, Tabby, and welcome back to the Modern Life Podcast. You can find us at modernlifepodcast.com, email us at modernlifepod@gmail.com, and find us on Instagram and Twitter at modernlifepod. This episode is coming out on the first day of fall, and fittingly, we're covering The Scapegoat by Daphne du Maurier. I want to thank our guest, Dr. Laura Varnam, for making the time and joining me for this discussion. She's a medievalist professor at Oxford University and an expert on Daphne du Maurier. If you ever get the chance to go to the Fowey Festival of Arts and Literature in Cornwall, you can catch her there giving lectures and running reading groups. You can also find Dr. Varnam in the documentary Daphne du Maurier in the Footsteps of Rebecca, and on an episode of the podcast Backlisted. She is the author of The Church as Sacred Space in Middle English Literature and Culture, and is currently working on another book which will focus on Daphne du Maurier. You can find her at her website, drlauravarnam.wordpress.com, on Instagram at Dr. Laura Varnam, and on Twitter at Laura Varnam. And just a quick warning, we will not just be spoiling The Scapegoat, but also briefly talk about Rebecca. So I encourage you to come back to this episode after reading both of these wonderful novels. This is our fourth du Maurier episode, so check out our back catalog for Rebecca, Jamaica Inn, and also My Cousin Rachel. We are starting things off with our modern thoughts and then jumping into the main topic. Thanks for listening.
You've had 3 weeks of masquerade as a French nobleman. And now it is time for you to change back and return to your provincial university. And if I refuse?
2 men, physically as alike as twins, but complete strangers. The one dedicated to sin, the other tricked into changing places to find himself the head of a large family he had never seen before.
Hello there, I'm here with Dr. Laura Varnam. How are you doing this evening?
I'm very well, thank you. It's really nice to be here.
Thank you so much for making the time. But we'll just jump right into our modern thoughts. So mine is about modern coverture law. And I know you'll be familiar with coverture law, but just to kind of explain it to the listeners, coverture is the idea that you as a woman do not have enough legal autonomy and need the men in your lives to kind of make the decisions for you. And in the United States, at least, we think of this kind of having gone by the way in the 70s with the Equal Credit Opportunity Act. But I actually found an article from Insider from February this year, which talks about female sterilization in the US. And it actually works very similarly still to the laws of coverture. So in order for a woman to get sterilized, you need, in many states, a psychologist's evaluation, write a personal statement, you need consent from your father or husband, there's a waiting period. Many insurances also don't cover it, and since it's prohibited in the Catholic Church, and 1 out of 6 hospitals in the US are Catholic, it's not available to very many women. And the flip side to this is that men can get sterilized without any issues. So I just thought it was interesting that in the year 2020, we're still dealing with this autonomy issue, and basically the patriarchy is alive and well. So that was my modern thought.
Wow, yeah, there is a long way to go on a lot of issues.
Yes.
Oh my goodness.
But yeah, what is yours? Tell us everything you got.
So my modern thought partly came out of thinking about the situation that we're all in with coronavirus, and thinking about some of the good that has come out of that. You know, the kindness that I think people have been showing to one another, the ways that communities have really rallied round, new communities have sprung up, people have got to know their neighbours better. That's one positive thing we can draw out of all of this. And it made me think about this moment in an essay that Daphne du Maurier wrote in the 1960s. It's an essay called This I Believe. You can find it in the Rebecca Notebook and Other Memories if you're interested in following it up. And in that essay, she's talking a bit about what we inherit from our ancestors, what control we have over ourselves as individuals. And she's thinking about the qualities that she has in she's in her 50s at this point, and the qualities that she had as a child. And she has this wonderful line in the essay where she says, "Kindness seems to me the one quality worth praising, but today I give it a longer name and call it compassion." And this idea of kindness and compassion really, I think, speaks to me at the moment, speaks to me in 2020. But I also, it really stood out to me thinking again about The Scapegoat over the last week or so, because I think compassion is something that The Scapegoat as a novel is about, which might seem surprising in some ways. Many people will know that I have two hats. I teach medieval literature in Oxford as well as working on Daphne du Maurier. In Middle English, the word kind means nature, what is natural. So it's actually within our natures to be kind.
Oh, I love that.
Isn't it great? It's one of my favourite sort of Middle English facts. And the word compassion, Daphne rephrases it and she says she likes to use the word compassion. And that goes back to Latin, and it means suffering with. So it means a kind of co-suffering or a kind of fellow feeling for others. And it just struck me that that's something that John, our narrator in The Scapegoat, starts to learn as he goes through the novel. He starts to learn to engage with others and to feel empathy with them. And so that's just something that I think is quite interesting when we're thinking about this novel. So yes, my modern thought hopefully takes us into our discussion.
That's beautiful. No, that's absolutely perfect. So let me just dive into the summary of the book. I love that. The Scapegoat by Daphne du Maurier came out in 1957 and was made into a film 2 years after its release, and also most recently in 2012. Our protagonist is an Englishman named John who notably speaks perfect French and is doing some vacationing and historical research in France. He runs across Jean de Gay, an impoverished count who looks exactly like him. After a night of drinking and fraternizing, John wakes up alone in a hotel room, robbed of his possessions, with Jean's chauffeur attempting to fetch him home to the estate. Despite John's protestations, the chauffeur isn't the only one mistaking him for the count. Fooling the whole family, John spends a week living another man's life. The reader slowly discovers through du Maurier's main character that this dysfunctional family harbors many secrets and resentments towards one another. John attempts to right many of the wrongs, but often his ignorance of the past prevents him from effecting the desired positive change. Jean's wife dies while John is still living his life, which prompts the real husband to return as there is a considerable inheritance to collect. In their last meeting, we discover that while John has tried making things better for the family estate and business, Jean has done everything he can to ruin the other man's small life in England. In the end, each of the doppelgangers returned to their previous lives without anyone but Jean's mistress knowing who he really was. So I was curious. In February, you went to a screening of The Scapegoat, which is the 1959 version in Hampstead, with du Maurier's grandson Rupert Tower. And they talked about this being her most psychological novel, and I think that also ties into what you had said about empathy. Can you speak a little bit towards that or what you learned there?
Yeah, absolutely. I think Rupert was absolutely right in picking out this psychological angle. And the really interesting thing about Rupert's perspective is that he is a Jungian analyst. And at the time Daphne was writing the novel, she was really fascinated by the ideas of the psychoanalyst Jung, this notion of everyone having two sides to their personality, that you have this darker side. And Daphne particularly associated that darker side, what she called her number two personality, with the writing side of her. Often she talks about that as a masculine side, and of course The Scapegoat's one of the 5 novels with a male narrator. So these ideas of everyone having their double within them, though, those ideas are really floating around in her mind in the 50s, and that's kind of one of the places that the novel comes out of. So it's a novel of ideas as much as it is driven by plot.
I was reading over your article and your report on going to the festival, and when Daphne said that he has to learn what to do with love after going to the monastery after living this week with them. I have so many questions about the ending because I did not understand her intent there, that people can change and have these two sides to them. And it's just one of those book endings that I think a lot about, but that I feel like goes with all Daphne du Maurier books. And I'm just thinking to myself, do you feel like she achieved this? Because I'm really struggling with, we see John really changing. And I think if I'd seen that from Jean de Gay, there might have been a point to it. But he has done everything he can to kind of destroy this other man's life, and then he just gets to go back to his family. And I do wonder, does he actually change after this? Is there enough evidence given in the book for us to think that he wouldn't just, plunge the family back into ruin?
I think it's a really interesting question. I mean, it is obviously, as you say, typical for Daphne to have these incredibly ambiguous endings. I think with Jean de Guy, we don't really know how he is going to behave when he gets back. I think you're right that we're probably quite pessimistic about that. But I think in that final chapter where John, our narrator, goes and sees Bella before he leaves, and they have that conversation where, of course, she knows he's not the real Jean de Guy, and she says, well, when we see Jean in the future, we will look for you in him. And one of the themes of the novel, it seems to me, is the ways in which the people that surround us expect certain things from us, and then we may play up to those expectations. So one of the interesting things about the doppelganger switch is that they're looking at him and they're expecting him to be their Jean, but he's not. But they can't see that because they're just seeing what they expect to see. So I sort of wonder if the way the family will behave towards him might in some way impact on his behaviour. I think the key change will be for John, our narrator. His entire life has been dismantled, so it's quite terrifying.
Yes.
But it gives him opportunities. And he does say at one point in the novel that he'd never really been concerned about other people before. He'd only really thought about himself. So he really was quite a selfish person. But now he's had these connections with others. Hopefully when he goes to the monastery and is able to meditate more and then go back off into the world, perhaps there is some hope there for him. But I can completely understand why it's an ending that works in an intellectual way. I did a reading group on this novel at Foy Festival a few years ago, and people said, yes, I can see that, but I still don't feel quite satisfied by the end.
Yes. Even though John is very selfish, Jean de Gay has a selfishness that's so destructive and harmful to others. And I just wonder at Daphne's choice of making him even more evil towards the end of the book. So then when Bela says, whatever it is, it can't be destroyed, it's taken root and it will go on growing inside him, what that tenderness that you have shown to us, I'm like, I don't know about that. Like, I still don't trust this guy. I don't know if you will agree with this, but I can see why both movie versions changed this ending to John staying in the family and taking over that life, because I don't see anyone pitching this to a movie studio and being like, oh, and then they each go back to their lives and one of them goes to the monastery. You know, I don't see a producer being keen on an ending like that.
Yeah, I mean, I totally get that. I can see that we want Jean de Guy to be punished. He's a bad guy. We don't like him. You know, we want John to triumph in the end. We want all the good he's created to continue and for him to benefit from it. You know, we think, well, Jean de Guy doesn't appreciate his family, so, you know, let him go off and do what he likes.
Right.
But then we sort of end up with a situation where John then has to get rid of Jean. So, you know, he becomes a murderer.
In the movies, you mean? They make him a murderer?
Yeah.
That is a significant change. That's true. They always try to make it look like, oh, it's self-defense or it's kind of an accident, though.
Yeah. Perhaps in the BBC, the 2012 one, it's to some extent more accidental. Perhaps it looks a bit more like self-defense as well, I suppose, perhaps in the Guinness one as well, because Jean has come back wanting to get rid of him, so it's act or be eliminated himself. But I then wonder, so if we're thinking about Daphne's ideas, psychological ideas for how this novel is working, then John has completely given in to his dark side. He's become Jean in a way that that will have negative implications, that he'll have to come to terms with that eventually, I would think.
Yeah, and because then you also wonder about, well, he's had to have disposed of the body somewhere, you know, throwing it in the furnace, and like, it's like, what happens after that? Yeah, you do kind of think about that.
Yeah, I mean, the furnace scene in the BBC one, that's really terrifying.
Yeah.
You know, and I can see it gives us that thriller sort of an ending.
Yes.
It's exciting, it's dramatic. In the Guinness version, it's got this kind of film noir sense to it. You know, suddenly the lamp is knocked over, shots are fired, and you're thinking, oh, what's happened?
Right.
Still too? Which is great. And I can completely see that on an adaptation level. But working through the sort of intellectual process that I think Daphne was really going through, it just doesn't it doesn't fit to what she wanted.
Yeah, I can see that now. But talking through it with you has really helped me, because it's just one of those endings where I'm like, what? I don't know what to think. This is actually from an article of yours, actually. You said in the 1950s, Daphne had also begun to research her French ancestors who were glass blowers. And that location of the glass factory in the book, it's just one of the most striking book locations that I can think of. And it's the way she's such an atmospheric writer, but I hear the glass bits like crunching under soles. I see the different colors like in my brain. And the idea of glass also ties into almost like this theme of reflection and transparency that's going on with John living in another person's life. And I always think it's such a shame that the films can't put that in there, but understandably, I also realize it's a budget issue and a safety issue, and you can't just have glass shards lying everywhere. Yeah. But it's just so, it's like too bad that it never makes it into any of the films.
Definitely. It's like, I think it's wonderful. And it is that point you just made about things being reflective, see-through, incredibly fragile and dangerous. Obviously, with the glass shards and that extraordinary scene where we find in the book Marie Noelle, the little girl, is down the well with all these pieces of glass, and she's been holding some of them in her hands, you know, almost like stigmata. She's the super religious little girl, and it does all kinds of things in the book that as you know, as you say, partly come from at the beginning of the 50s, Daphne's doing more research into her French ancestors. You know, she finds out they were glass blowers, and again, this is a novel that's about the sort of English and French sides of Daphne's personality and how they can be reconciled, if they can be. So obviously the BBC adaptation makes quite a big choice in resetting it in England rather than sticking with the French setting.
Did you like that framing device of the coronation?
It was really interesting rewatching it. I first watched it when it came out in 2012, and my memory of it was that I really didn't like it because I thought the Frenchness was so key. But rewatching it this week, I did actually quite like it. There's a bit where Johnny Spence, so the French one who is French in the novel, he talks about this moment just before the Queen's coronation being a moment of sort of potential anarchy, because technically there's nobody on the throne. So this is a moment when things are quite open in a sort of carnivalesque kind of way. It made me think, you know, there's a kind of usurpation plot here, because he makes the point that, you know, Elizabeth II shouldn't have been queen if it hadn't have been for the abdication and so on. So that throws an interesting light on John, because he takes his place at the head of a family that wasn't his. What did you think about it?
I liked it. I didn't mind them having it set entirely in England. I think it's a little bit easier to do, just filming wise, than bringing another nation in there. But what you had said about Daphne du Maurier and her French side and her English side, she does something in the book that I think very few people are able to truly accomplish, and that is setting something in a different language, but it's written in English, the book is written in English, but it constantly reminds you that these people are French. And one of the instances I can think of is when she does throw in French words like tenderness, she always writes as tendresse. And then when the mother says, I'm suffering, she says, je souffre. And then she has this whole little bit about how you can only express that in French. And John's relationship to the French language and why he loves it so much and studies it so much is brilliantly put into the novel. And you never finish it and you're like, oh, I forgot that this was taking place in France or anything like that. She's so in command of her settings at all times. But I don't know if that would be easy to put into a film, but I loved it in the book.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right about that. It's there in a way that we feel immersed in it, but we don't feel alienated from it. There's enough French for us to get that setting linguistically, and in her brilliant descriptions of the chateau and the glass factory.
Yes.
And it's, it is such an important part of her identity. That's one of the great things about the most recent biography of Daphne, Mandalay Forever, by Tatiana de Ronay, who is a Franco-British novelist living in Paris, and she really evokes all of the kind of Frenchness of Daphne's life and how important it is, and how important Paris was when she was younger. And so I do think it's a shame that the BBC doesn't do that, but I can also see why.
That's fascinating. I did not know that much about her French background until I started reading your articles on it. Are there other books of hers that you would recommend that are also a little bit French, I guess?
Yeah, so after The Scapegoat, in 1963, she writes The Glassblowers. Which is all about the French ancestors during the French Revolution. So that's definitely one to look at. Earlier on in the 30s, in 1937, I think I'm right in saying, she writes The du Mauriers, which starts with her great-great-grandmother, Mary Ann Clark, who's English and has caused a big scandal by having an affair with the Duke of York and getting into all of this trouble selling military commissions. And eventually she goes off to Paris, and her daughter Ellen meets Louis Maturin. They get married, and then that starts the kind of French sort of side of the du Maurier family. So that novel, The Du Mauriers, from 1937, it explores that kind of marrying up of the English and the French side. So it's something that's well worth pursuing when you're thinking about du Maurier.
Oh, fascinating. This is only my fourth one, and I've barely scratched the surface with her. So I can't wait to dive into more of that. I actually had a question about Marie Noelle, since you had brought her up. I find her such a strange child, and maybe because this is such a common trope nowadays in movies of having the wise child, the 6-year-old, but they speak like they're 80 years old. And I kind of felt that way about Marie Noelle, and it made her less real to me. And I couldn't decide if that was a choice or if she just didn't write the child characters as well as the adult ones. But you'll have to educate me on that.
Ooh, that is such an interesting thought. I suppose she partly has that plot function along with the dog and the child and Bella, who, she's the Hungarian mistress who's sort of slightly outside of the family. They're the ones who don't believe in the switch that's taken place. So she has that kind of wisdom about her. There is something really odd about Marie Noelle, the intense religiosity. I mean, I think she has quite a charming relationship with her father in some ways, but she's also possessive of him. And I think this might be, it's partly coming from Daphne's relationship with her own father. She had a very close relationship with Gerald, who was an actor, of course, always playing somebody else. He was always in
interesting
kind of double role, and of course most famously played both Captain Hook and Mr. Darling in the stage play of Peter Pan. So that's a real kind of classic double role. And one of the reasons, this is a slight tangent, but one of the reasons why Daphne was so keen for Alec Guinness to play John in the film is because Alec Guinness really does look quite like Gerald du Maurier. So there's a link there in Daphne's mind. I suppose I also think there's something going on with both the relationship between father and child, and then the really intense influence that Blanche has over Marie-Noël in kind of shaping this intense religious feeling.
Yes.
So I think she's doing something with thinking about how a child might feel growing up in that kind of environment. Trying to think about other children in du Maurier novels.
There are not that many, are there?
There's a whole group of sort of lost boys in Rule Britannia, which is her last book, where Mad, who's this 80-year-old grandmother figure, she's taken in all of these boys who are lost in one way or another. And so they're a sort of rewriting of the Lost Boys from Peter Pan. I suppose children are often sort of strange creatures in du Maurier. There is this sense of either growing up too soon or not wanting to grow up, which is very Peter Pan. Very Peter Pan idea.
Interesting. Yeah, you also had brought up Blanche. I think she is my favorite character in the book. Because
interesting.
Yeah, I just see her being trapped in this crumbling estate. She's unmarried. She has this horrid family. I understand why she becomes this religious fanatic to maybe deal with all this trauma. And it's also so important to note that the generations of survivors of the war and of the Holocaust and that entire time, they did not have a culture of talking about anything or, seeking help, going to a therapist. And we now have psychological evidence that has really hurt those types of people and that has had lasting effects not talking about any of this. And that's just always what I think about with Blanche and really the whole family, because they don't talk about things. She doesn't talk to her brother. I just think of her past being so sad and religion being this really unhealthy Band-Aid almost that she puts over it. She doesn't use religion in a very healthy way. And I just find her absolutely fascinating.
That's so interesting. I can completely see that because she's so, you get such a lot of tension from that relationship. This, powerful woman there who's repressing everything, and for some reason that John just doesn't quite understand yet, she hates him and she doesn't want to speak to him, and he keeps making all of these incredibly awkward mistakes around her, giving her the gift that was meant for Bella. That whole storyline going back to the war is a really important part of the kind of secrets that are at the heart of the novel.
Yes, I agree. Also at the end when his wife dies and they need a blood transfusion. And he goes, no, that's not my blood type, because he knows he's not the real Jean de Gay. And right away she assumes, you just want her to die. That's why you don't want to give the blood transfusion. Like, this family is so horrible to each other.
Yeah. Yeah, they are. It's quite extraordinary the way that du Maurier manages to keep peeling back these layers. And just when you think, he's kind of got a handle on this relationship, then he makes another faux pas and there's something else behind it that he's gradually learning. It's great.
What did you think about Blanche in the newest movie? I thought sometimes she was a little too shrill, but then I also really liked the change of her. It's implied that she's gay, and it's a little bit of, I guess, a lighter twist on this really dark history that they went through in World War II. Because her lover kind of killed herself because John Spence had an affair with her. They have that line in there too about she had nobody to turn to, she had nobody to speak to. I thought it was an interesting change, but it definitely removes some of that quiet strength that you had just spoken about to the character.
Yeah, I think you're right. I quite liked it. I liked the idea that, I suppose it makes the jealousy work in a different way, because in the BBC one, I think she says something like, you just wanted her because I wanted her. You always want something you can't have, so you just took her from me. Whereas I think Blanche in the book says that Jean de Guy wanted Maurice Duval removed because he was jealous of how popular he was.
Yes. Yeah.
With the men at the glass factory. So it's a different spin on that idea of jealousy. I think in the BBC one, I was struck by how cruel Johnny Spence was to the various women, to Frances, the wife in particular, but also to Bella. He assaults her. We see her,
yes,
with her.
You're right.
And you just think, wow, this man is misogynistic on a appalling level.
It is strange, that scene where he comes back for the inheritance and he makes his wife take some kind of medication to kill herself. I just thought it weakened her so much. Like, why would she listen to him? Why would she do this? Her death is a little bit more mysterious in the book. And then also, when she's going to wake up, she's going to remember this, isn't she? Like, how are they going to fix that relationship? Like, what is he going to say? I just thought that was a weird change, to have her consciously making that decision with him right there to kill herself. I don't know.
Yeah, I agree with you, and it makes Johnny Spence a really wicked character. Whereas in the novel, we don't really know what's happened with Francoise. She seems to have leant out of the window, maybe to retrieve the locket. At least that's what Marie-Noël...
What do you think? What do you think happened?
I don't know. Sometimes I read it and I think, well, Francoise was so downtrodden by this point. She felt that everybody just wanted her to die, from her mother-in-law to Renee, to everybody, and that she does commit suicide. Obviously, that has implications because she's pregnant, and so then I think, well, would she have acted in that way? And then I think it's interesting that the issue of suicide is cleared up by the little girl who goes out onto the windowsill, comes back in with the locket and the duster and says, oh, look, she either leant out too far and she fell, or she was trying to get the locket. She didn't want it to have dropped. And that's incredibly convenient for John/Jeanne. And the little girl is willing to do all kinds of strange things.
Oh, you're right.
Support her father. So when I reread it this week, I thought, has she made that up? Has she made up that scenario?
Oh, I hadn't even thought about that.
I just suddenly became really suspicious because I think they go upstairs. John is with the policeman who's come, and they go into Francois' bedroom, and at just that moment, Marie-Noël is leaning out, and then suddenly, oh, look what I found. I don't know, I don't think Daphne makes it clear. It's her classic ambiguity.
Yeah. So another thing I found really interesting is with Daphne du Maurier films, I think it's really hard not to do a voiceover. I hate voiceovers. And I thought Matthew Rhys did such a great job of playing so many emotions on his face, because so much goes on internally in what he's going through. And I thought it was all communicated perfectly. And in the Alec Guinness version, which does have a voiceover, I found out that so many scenes were deleted from that film, which caused him to record that voiceover. And he is one of my favorite actors. He's immensely talented, so I definitely think there would have been a version possible for him to, again, play all that out on his face. And I there's just so many things that kind of went wrong with that film, and I feel like it could have been much better.
Absolutely agree. It was a bit of a mess on a lot of different levels, and Daphne was so disappointed in it. She had such high hopes for it with Alec Guinness.
Yes.
But they cut a lot, and then that meant they had to do a voiceover. They cut a lot of Betty Davis's scenes, and she was not happy about that.
Well, she wasn't good in it. She is so melodramatic in this film. It's a bad performance. Alec Guinness didn't get along with her, neither did the director, who was suffering from health issues during this filming. Yeah. I mean, she really did not portray the strength and hold this matriarch has over the family well. Yeah,
she really didn't. She's sort of dwarfed by all the kind of soft furnishings and the flowers, and it's all very claustrophobic.
Yes.
and sort of there's a weirdly sexualized vibe with her and her an Alec Guinness. She's possessive in this creepy way,
Hmm.
whereas in the BBC one with, I think Eileen Atkins has got some of the power that we see of the mother in the book. But no, Betty Davis was really not happy, and she sort of barely spoke of the film again. It isn't really discussed in any biographies, autobiographies of her. It's one that gets a bit brushed under the carpet.
Understandably so. Yes, I think also something that really annoyed me in this film was this weird, like, orchestral upbeat music. And there was a score written for it that I am assuming it must be lost. The music that we have now is not the original music for the film. And especially with a really atmospheric Daphne du Maurier book, like the score for the Alec Guinness version was just such a failure. It's like, oh, this is not Daphne. This is not the mood we're going for here.
Yeah, particularly if you compare it to, something like the music for the Hitchcock Rebecca.
Oh my gosh, yes. Yeah.
Franz Waxman, am I remembering that rightly? But it's just extraordinary. And you hear a bar of that music and you're there at Mandalay.
That's true, yes. And the 2012 actually had this, really only had one song, but it was this wonderful building theme that started out very slowly and then just got more intense. And I thought they actually did a really good job with the music in the newer one.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right there.
And then I had already asked you questions about this, but I also thought it was interesting viewing the Alec Guinness version, how the Hays Code had kind of fallen by the wayside. And I mean, this has been so detrimental to Rebecca, to Jamaica Inn, where restrictions of the time did not allow you to do anything. But there were so many things in this Alec Guinness movie where I was like, oh, how did they get that in there? They're talking about like miscarriage and mistresses, and I was like, okay, like we're getting more hip now in the 50s.
I think there've been quite a lot of challenges to the Hays Code in the early 50s, so I think in some ways this adaptation benefits from that slightly less restrictive environment, whereas obviously with Hitchcock's Rebecca, the key change is that you're not allowed the hero of the film to get away with murder, so then Rebecca's murder becomes an accident. I think in some ways plays interestingly as a viewer, because when you'll remember that scene has Laurence Olivier in the boathouse narrating what had happened, telling the new Mrs. De Winter, well, she came towards me and this happened and that happened. Most viewers would probably, certainly now, will know that that's not true. That's not what happens in the book. So it makes us view Maxim de Winter very suspiciously at that moment. We know what you really did.
Going back to the character of the mom, there's some scenes in the newer version that I find so lovely, and I think one of them is the shooting feast that they have in the barn, where Paul gives that speech to his mom, and they have this toast, and she has that moment of like, oh, maybe my younger son isn't an idiot after all. And then you kind of see Paul and Renee holding hands. And I'm like, I just love those sweet little moments that they put into the new film, but maybe it's too sugary for you. I don't know.
No, I think it's great, because it does show that sort of John Standing has come into this place where everything can be shook up a bit. They're not all stuck in this rut. And because he comes in and changes things, all of a sudden we see, well, maybe his brother isn't a complete loser. Maybe the marriage can take off again, and Johnny Spence's own marriage can start to flourish. The mother doesn't have to be stuck upstairs. So all of these things that seem fossilized and in a state of decay start to grow a little bit.
Oh, that's perfect.
Which I do think, I think that kind of speaks to some of the things that Daphne's interested in. What can flourish if things change?
Yes, and later on when they have the discussion in the hospital where John says to Renee, she says, oh, you and your husband looked so strong together at the luncheon, and you're just what he needs. I start crying a little bit. I'm like, oh, that's so sweet. Like, this family can be saved. But I actually like what you said about things crumbling and things being fossilized, because I love the estate as kind of a symbol of that. And I think a really good example of this is, I mean, it's a little bit earlier, but Downton Abbey, we have this like new generation, it's the 1900s, and like you cannot sustain these estates anymore. There's a scene in the 2012 one where he's like, I'm going to save the business, I'm going to sell one of the paintings, and the mom's like, go ahead, it's a fake. Like this is all a facade. And I don't know why, but in the book, the castle or the estate having this moat around it, I don't know why it's important to me, but it's almost like it separates it from the rest of the community, and they're living in this crumbling fantasy land where they're stuck in the past and they can't get out of these old conceptions they have of each other.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think it kind of sets them apart from the workers, and there's that whole point about Jean de Guy. He doesn't care about the workers at the glass factory. He's not bothered at all.
Yes.
He doesn't care about them. You know, he's the aristocratic count, and you know, he's just interested in himself. And I think it also speaks to du Maurier's own investigations of her family backgrounds, because the du Maurier name was added by one of the French ancestors to make them sound like they were aristocratic. And then she was thinking, well, you know, how would my father Gerald, how would grandfather George what would they have thought about the fact that these du Mauriers are not, you know, these displaced French aristocrats? They were glassblowers. So I think there's something going on there with thinking through those family origins. And the chateau, as you say, is this perfect sort of embodiment of the secrets of the past. It's giving us all those gothic cues that,
that's true.
You know, the mother's the mad woman in the attic. There's all these secrets.
Why didn't I think about that? Yeah, you're right.
I just sort of thought about that now, because when you think, I was really struck in the 2012 version when John first goes into the house and he's walking around and he's trying out, you know, he's going in different rooms and thinking, well, what's in here? Who's in here? Where am I supposed to go? And you get that same vibe with Mrs. De Winter and Rebecca when she arrives at Mandalay. She doesn't know where anything is. She doesn't know where the drawing room is. And then she suddenly discovers the West Wing, which is, you know, full of Rebecca's memory, quite literally, all the materials, all of her clothes. So I think the chateau is operating in similar kinds of ways.
Interesting. Yeah.
You don't know what's in the next room.
Yes, I love him sneaking around. I thought Matthew Rhys played that so well when he comes into the breakfast room and he just stops and he doesn't know where to sit and he pulls out the wrong chair and everyone's like, what are you doing? And he's like, I don't know. And also him running up to Marie Noel's room when she threatens to throw herself out the window and he's like, which room is it? Like, I just thought that was perfect.
And I think what was so clever about that early bit in the BBC one is it's played almost as farce, because you think, well, yeah, this is ridiculous. What is he doing here? He's, you know, he keeps making these wrong moves. It's a brilliant bit when with Sheridan Smith, who's playing his sister-in-law, the one he's having the affair with, and he sort of tries to have an interaction with her, and she just slaps his face and says, "Don't touch me," and sort of rushes off. This is ridiculous. It is farce, but then it suddenly becomes suspense, and so that shift works really well, I think, because you think, why doesn't he just leave? This is madness.
Yes. I actually love that you mentioned suspense, because her writing here, where it's almost like a detective story, and you know, you have that opening of the presents and you're like, what's in the presents? And just reading this book for the first time, I was doing the audiobook and I would always be so mad when I would get to work because I'm like, I need to know what happens. Like, she does that so well, and it's still at this really slow pace, but I'm not using slow in a bad way here. She just really takes her time and she has it plotted out and she knows what she's doing. It's just when you read one of her books, you're like, oh, I'm in good hands, you know?
Yeah. Absolutely. And I think one of the reasons why this works so well is the action takes place over a week. It's quite a short amount of time, but she's going through every day, almost meal by meal, moment by moment, as these different things are happening and gradually revealing who everyone is. And I think the first couple of chapters at the chateau, when there's all these women and we as a reader start to think, well, okay, one's the wife, one might be the mistress. Like, how many women has he got on the go here? Right. Who are they all? It's just brilliant as you see him fumbling to figure out how he's supposed to behave.
Yes, and you said this back in 2010. You said this in an article that it's like a detective story, and that just hits the nail on the head. That's absolutely perfect.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've seen any Goodreads reviews of this book, but so many of them are like 2 stars. It's not realistic that 2 people would look exactly the same. And I'm like, oh, you missed the point. That's not the point.
Yeah.
Like, Daphne knows it's not realistic.
Yeah, she was concerned about that. She wrote a letter to her publisher, Victor Glantz, and said, I've got to get this right at the beginning. People have got to buy it as an idea. And I think that's why it's really good in the book that before he's met Jean de Guy, he is mistaken for him by somebody in the town.
Mm-hmm.
And, someone said, starts talking to him, and he's kind of, oh, that's weird. You've mistaken me for somebody else, and walks off. So we already know it's plausible that he looks like somebody else.
Mm.
Obviously, we know he's a perfect French speaker, but I think, that so isn't the point.
Yes.
And there are plenty of doppelganger novels, from Prisoner of Zenda to The Prince and the Pauper.
Yes,
to,
yes.
There's all kinds of ones where those switches happen. But the interesting thing is it going to work? Is he going to be found out? And how is he going to behave playing another man's part?
You had said this as well. It doesn't even matter if he doesn't behave correctly, because it's about everybody else's expectations of him. And they don't see him for who he is anyways.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And there's a wonderful bit, again, I think fairly early on, when John suddenly realizes, well, the thing he was worried about, they'll know it's a different person. They are not seeing that at all.
Mm-hmm.
So suddenly he has this almost exhilarating feeling of freedom, and he thinks, well, I can do anything I like because I'm not me, I'm him.
Mm-hmm.
I can do anything. And that's both liberating and a bit frightening.
Mm-hmm.
I think he says something like, I could really mess with their lives. But thankfully he goes down the more positive route of trying to help them.
Yeah, and I also think that out of the 4 books I've read, this is the one that has the most amount of quotes that I have written down in a book. I just love her writing here. There's one part, and this is right after the wife Francoise dies, and I think it's one of the servants or one of the other characters says, "Death is beautiful. Madame Jean might be an angel in the sky," when they look upon her dead body. And then John says, "I did not agree. Death was an executioner lopping a flower before it bloomed. The sky had glories enough, but not the soil." I just thought that was such a beautiful line.
Yeah, she's brilliant. There are some fantastic passages in here. There are some great discussions of the way she does the psychology, and she talks about at one point, Jeanne's inner substance was part of my nature, part of my secret self. I really like that description.
And it also ties into what she set out to do, this idea that you had mentioned of the 2 selves and one being the secret one, and we have to find balance somehow between the 2.
Yeah. I mean, she says very famously in a letter that's quoted in Margaret Forster's biography that we are all doubles. We all have our dark side. And so many of her stories are about how you reconcile yourself with that dark side of your personality. How do you deal with those inner demons? And, a lot of the time she uses her writing to try to both engage with those and to deal with them, to kind of package them up, to try to get over them.
Yes, I totally agree. And I know I've said the word atmospheric now 20 times, but just in the way that she's able to create a mood. And she does this a lot through using nature as well. And I love the depictions of autumn in this novel. This is like the perfect fall book. And this is about the chestnuts that are falling. I'm just going to read it really quickly. This whole quote is probably my favorite Daphne du Maurier quote. So it says, once again, the little plopping thud that had disturbed me in the dressing room sounded close by, and I saw that it was the chestnuts falling from the trees onto the gravel path beyond the moat. No rising mist, no falling leaf, no pattering rain could have marked with such finality the end of summer. There was the whole of autumn in the sound. I want to get that whole thing tattooed on my body. It's so beautiful.
It's perfect, isn't it? Perfect for this time of year.
Yes.
Wow. So yeah, she is so evocative. You're just there in those places with her. It's such a skill.
Yes. Did you have any last notes about this? Anything else that we haven't brought up yet?
Gosh, I think we've ranged pretty widely over the things that I was thinking about. I think both adaptations are well worth watching if listeners can get hold of them. The BBC one is fairly easy to get on DVD. The Alec Guinness one's slightly less easy to get a hold of, but definitely worth watching. It's something that I think with du Maurier, it's so hard to translate those first person narratives into film. So that translation from one medium into the other and into another is really challenging. But as I think we've shown in our discussion, by doing that, by adapting her books, you always go back to the book with a different thought, I think, and you go, well, okay, why didn't Daphne do it this way? Why did she do it the way she did it? One thing that just occurred to me with the BBC one, I don't know if you remember when the titles come up, the E of the and then the scape of scapegoat pops out first, so you get escape.
Yes.
And then the other letters come out. And I thought that was really clever of the BBC one, because there is this notion of escaping into somebody else's life.
And that's very relatable. Who doesn't get sick of their lives sometimes?
Definitely. There's a line where Marie Noelle says to John in the novel, do you think it would be easier to be someone else? And I think we often think, gosh, I wish I was this person, or oh, it would be so much easier if I wasn't me. And then John acts that out for us, and we see, well, no, it isn't always easy to be somebody else, to take on their problems.
I totally agree. Yeah, no, this was absolutely perfect. Thank you again for coming on and discussing this novel with me. It's just, I think with Daphne, when you talk to somebody else about it, it helps you organize your thoughts on it. It's not, you can't just read one of her books and forget about it.
Yeah, I completely agree. That's why one of my favorite sort of things to do with Daphne is running the reading groups at the du Maurier Festival in Cornwall. And it's just amazing to get a whole bunch of readers in a room, particularly, with something as ambiguous as My Cousin Rachel, for example, and just to hear where people are coming from and what they can see. And you can have such a good discussion. And I've come out of this discussion with you thinking all kinds of extra thoughts that I hadn't had before. So it's been brilliant. I'm really grateful to you for having me on.
Oh, no, thank you. And where can people find you online? Where can they follow you?
So you can follow me on Instagram. I'm at Dr. Laura Varnam. And in fact, in September with Contrary Reader, with Kelly, we're running a reading group discussion of Rebecca. So if you want to start reading Rebecca over the coming month, that would be a great idea. I'm on Twitter at Laura Varnam. I've also got a personal website, which is lauravarnam.wordpress.com. But yeah, you can find me all over the internet chatting about Daphne.
Perfect. Beautiful. Thank you again.
Thank you very much.
It is extraordinary us meeting like this, isn't it? Yes, I suppose it is. I mean, don't you think there's something special about now? This moment between the death of one monarch and the coronation of the next. What do you mean? Well, anything's possible. The throne's empty. No one's in charge. To anarchy. To anarchy.